you.
Here to react to all of this, we're joined by Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton, who brought that election lawsuit before the Supreme Court. We all remember that. And Ken, it's great to see you. You're now leading 10 states in a new lawsuit against another big tech giant, this one aimed at Google. You're alleging that Google illegally sought to suppress competition and reap massive profits from targeted advertisements placed across the web. What do you really hope to accomplish here, and how big of a problem is big tech when it comes to civil liberties?
Well, look, everybody thinks the internet's free, and these large companies like Google have hidden the fact that they're making massive profits at the expense of small business owners and consumers really around the world. And so our goal is to open competition so that consumers get treated fairly, and that small businesses and even large businesses get treated fairly.
What's the latest with the lawsuit? How has your evidence been gathered, and what's your plan of attack here?
So we've spent more than a year doing an investigation. We set up these things called civil investigative demands, where we've asked questions, or almost like depositions or interrogatories, where we've asked in-depth questions of different people from both Google and third parties. We've gotten emails, and so we feel like we have a very, very strong case. I think you could read the complaint and see that we have a very strong case to show that Google has pretty much taken over the entire advertising world on the internet. It would be like you were watching the World Series and you find out at the end of the game that the pitcher, the batter, and the umpire were all working together to collude for an outcome, and that's what's going on with Google.
Well, we've seen big tech really overplay their hand when it comes to election-related issues. And speaking of those, let's talk about the case that you had presented before the Supreme Court, or wanted to. It was thrown out, but it came up yesterday during the Senate hearing in an exchange between Senator Rand Paul and former independent counsel Ken Starr. Take a listen to this.
When you see the 60 court cases rejected, do you think that's a conclusion by our court system that there is no fraud, or do you think that the court cases were primarily rejected for procedural reasons?
Right, Senator Paul, it is my understanding that the vast majority of these cases were rejected for rightly stated procedural reasons, as opposed to merits-based or substantive-based evaluations.
Ken, do you think it was procedural reasons as to why the Supreme Court didn't hear your case?
Well, they certainly gave the idea that we didn't have standing to sue. The problem that I have with that is, under the Constitution, the way the framers set it up is the only place that states could sue each other was at the Supreme Court. We can't go to a federal district court in Texas. Wouldn't be fair. And so instead of having states, sue each other in their own states, or pick up arms and fight each other, the Supreme Court was set as the place for states to have their cases heard. So it seems like we should at least have our day in court, at least one day in court. Everyone else has that opportunity in a federal court or a state court. We didn't even get a chance to make the argument.
I know a lot of people were the Trump supporters out there really hoping for this big Texas lawsuit, especially considering we saw President Trump appoint 3 justices to the Supreme Court. Were you disappointed that you didn't have the opportunity to present the evidence you say you found?
I absolutely was disappointed. We weren't even really making fraud charges. We were saying under the Constitution that state legislators are responsible for setting the rules of federal elections. And in this case, it turned out in these states that we sued that they didn't do that. They set the rules, but they were changed by local officials, election officials, judges all across the state. So people were treated differently inside the state. And then my voters were disenfranchised because we followed our laws, and yet they weren't required to follow their laws.
Again, we saw sort of those goalposts being changed, that extension of accepting mail-in ballots in the state of Pennsylvania, specifically, and other states as well, adjusting their rules, considering their new rules and regulations around these mail-in ballots that we've seen. But also during yesterday's hearing, we heard from Chris Krebs, the former director of cybersecurity and infrastructure, doubling down on the statement that he'd made previously, saying the November 3rd election was the most secure in American history. Ken, based on the evidence you've seen, of course, not allegations or accusations, actual evidence, would you agree with Krebs' statement?
I guess you'd have to figure out what the definition of secure is. If the definition of secure is the most credible election that we've had, no, there's no way that this was a credible election. These states took in all these mail-in ballots, and as I know, we prosecute election fraud here, and more than half of our cases deal with mail-in ballots. So I know that it's much easier to commit fraud in mail-in ballots because you don't have to show a photo ID. So Pennsylvania, as an example, had 233,000 mail-in ballots 4 years ago. This year, they had more than 10 times that at 2.5 million. So you're already talking about less credible votes. But then on top of that, in many of the counties in Pennsylvania and across the nation, they didn't even verify signatures, which makes them impossible. It's impossible to know whether one of those ballots was fraudulent or all 2.5 million. We can't even go back and look. It's very frustrating. And I would have to say, maybe in a very narrow definition of secure, it might be the most secure election, but in a broad definition of did we have credible results? And the answer, I don't think, is not yes.
Wow. All right. Ken Paxton, the Attorney General of Texas, taking the time joining us here on National Report. Ken, thank you very much.
Have a great night.
You just watched Newsmax TV, America's fastest growing cable news channel, now in more than 70 million homes. You can get Newsmax TV on your cable system or check your cable guide. And if your system doesn't carry Newsmax, call them, tell them you want Newsmax TV, because we're real news for real people.